Welcome to Founding Chronicles, where the forgotten stories of America's past come alive. If you enjoy uncovering history's secrets, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell icon so you never miss a journey into the past. Now let us step back in time to a story hidden in the shadows of America's memory. The story begins in the quiet years after the Civil War, a time when America was still finding its identity, still stitching itself together after being torn apart by fire and blood. Out of that landscape rose men and women who would become icons, figures whose names we still whisper with reverence, whose faces we recognize in old photographs, whose lives became the stuff of legend. But behind every legend there are shadows, and behind every photograph there are pieces left out of the frame. This story is about one of those shadows, a son who lived in silence, forgotten, hidden from the light of history, yet bound by blood to an American icon. He was not born into privilege. His beginnings were quiet, almost secretive, in a small town where whispers traveled faster than the wind. His mother was a young woman whose life had crossed paths with a man who would later become an American legend. Their meeting was brief, almost accidental, the kind of encounter that would be dismissed in the rush of time. But sometimes the smallest sparks ignite the longest shadows. The icon, as history remembers him, was a man of great stature. He stood at the center of his generation, his voice, his actions, his very presence shaping the way Americans saw themselves. He belonged to the world, not to one family. Yet in that world stage, in that blinding spotlight, there was no space for scandal, no space for the truth that a woman had carried his child into a life of lie. Secrecy. The boy grew up without the weight of his father's name, but he carried the features of that famous bloodline. Those who knew him in his small circle would sometimes pause, tilting their heads, wondering why his eyes seemed so familiar, why his chin carried the mark of someone they had seen in the papers, or on the stage, or standing proudly in uniform. But questions were never asked aloud. In that era, silence was safer than truth. His mother protected him fiercely. She worked long hours, sometimes in laundries, sometimes cleaning rooms for travelers passing through, sometimes sewing late into the night by candlelight. She was determined that her son would grow up with dignity, even if he had no father's hand to guide him. She told him stories, not of his true father, but of the strength of men who had built America with their hands, of soldiers who had marched through the war, of pioneers who had carried their families west against the odds. She gave him heroes to look up to, because the one hero who belonged to him by blood could never be spoken of. The boy's life was a mixture of hardship and wonder. He fished along the riverbanks, ran through fields with the other children, and learned early that survival came from hard work. But unlike the other boys, he often felt something missing. He would see fathers lift their sons onto their shoulders at town gatherings, see men teaching their boys how to split wood, how to steady a rifle, how to stand tall. He watched from a distance, knowing he would never feel that guiding hand. As he grew, so did the whispers. A neighbor might lean in too close and say, "He looks like someone I know." A passerby might squint and mutter, "There's something about that boy." But his mother would quickly hush them, shifting the conversation, reminding them of the dignity of privacy. For her, the truth was a weight too dangerous to share. The icon was untouchable, his reputation too sacred to be linked with scandal. The world had chosen to see him as perfect, and there was no room for a secret son. Yet the boy could feel it inside him, that pull toward something larger, that knowing sense that he belonged to more than the life he was given. He had dreams that did not fit the small town's boundaries. He had ambition that seemed to burn brighter than his peers. And when he looked in the mirror, he saw a face that seemed built for history, even if history had turned its back on him. The years moved forward, and America changed around him. Railroads cut through the land. Telegraphs carried words faster than ever. Cities swelled with people chasing new futures. His father, the man the world adored, was rising higher, becoming more than just a man. His name was etched into newspapers, his likeness spread in photographs, his voice carried in speeches that stirred hearts. He was America's son, claimed by the people. And yet, somewhere in the shadows, his true son was carving out a quiet existence, invisible to the world that worshipped his father. The mother aged quickly under the burden of secrecy. She lived with the constant fear that someone might discover the truth, that someone might write a letter or spread a rumor. She reminded her son, again and again, that he must never seek his father, never step into that world, never disturb the delicate image the nation had built. But for a boy growing into a man, such warnings only deepened the hunger to know the truth. And so he began to search in small ways, listening for his father's name in the taverns, following the news from the city, keeping scraps of newspapers folded carefully under his bed. Each article, each photograph, each word spoken about the man the country revered was a thread he stitched into his heart. He memorized his father's gestures, his stance, his voice. And sometimes, when he stood alone, he would mimic those gestures, practicing in the mirror, wondering if the bloodline he carried would one day demand recognition. But recognition, in that America, was not meant for him. It was meant for the icon, untarnished, untouchable. The boy was a secret, and secrets in that time were buried deep. Yet history has a way of letting the buried rise again, and even the most carefully hidden truths have a way of breaking through the cracks, because this was not just any boy. This was the son of a man whose life became a symbol of America itself. And while the world saw the father as larger than life, the son lived as a ghost walking among the people, unknown, unseen, but carrying within him a piece of history so powerful it could shake the story we thought we knew about one of America's greatest icons. The boy was becoming a man, and with each passing year, his resemblance to the icon grew sharper. His jawline carried the same defiance, his shoulders squared the same way, his eyes carried that same steady fire. In a small town, people notice things like that, even if they don't speak them aloud. The whispers never stopped. They only softened, became more careful, spoken in kitchens, in barns, in hushed voices behind closed doors. For the mother, every whisper was a dagger. She had sacrificed everything to keep her son hidden from the glare of scandal. She had made peace with her own heartbreak, with the loneliness of carrying a love that could never be named. But she feared for her son, feared that he might one day crave the truth more than he craved safety. She often sat him down, her tired hands gripping his shoulders, her voice trembling as she reminded him, "What the world loves, it will not forgive. Remember that, my boy." But sons do not always listen, especially not sons who carry in their veins the restless energy of a man who was born to change history. The icon, his father, was no longer just a man. He had become a towering symbol, an embodiment of American resilience, progress, and promise. His speeches filled the air with hope. His presence drew crowds that stretched down streets. His very life was etched into the memory of a nation that needed someone to believe in. He belonged to the people, and his name was spoken in reverence, like Scripture. And yet, for the son, every public triumph of his father was a private wound. He would read the newspapers in silence, his eyes tracing over the praises, the grand achievements, the bold declarations. And he would feel the ache of knowing that none of it belonged to him. The man whose face stared proudly from the paper was his blood, yet his heart was unreachable. To the world, the icon was flawless. To the son, he was simply absent. Sometimes, late at night, he would take out the clippings he had gathered over the years' yellowed pages, carefully folded and kept. He would spread them out on the wooden table and study his father's face. He knew every line, every crease, every expression. He would whisper to himself words he wished he could say aloud, I am yours. Don't you see me? But the papers never answered, and the silence of the small house always swallowed his words whole. As America raced forward, the son's life trudged along in the shadows. He worked in fields, and in workshops, then in the growing factories that roared like iron beasts. His hands became rough, his back grew strong, and he learned the value of labor. But no matter how hard he worked, he never felt that he belonged fully to the life he was given. There was always a sense that he was meant for something larger, something beyond the dust and the sweat and the endless routine of survival. It wasn't ambition alone, it was inheritance. It was the silent tug of a bloodline that demanded recognition. In the town, there were always people ready to speculate. Some pitied him, believing his mother had been wronged. Some judged him, as if he were a living reminder of sin. Some simply looked away, afraid of becoming entangled in a truth too heavy to bear. But in every corner, in every glance, there was the unspoken awareness that this boy carried the face of a man who did not live there. A man who lived in history books, in speeches, in the memory of a nation. The mother tried to hold it all together. She poured her life into keeping her son steady, into building a shield around him. But the years wore her down. Her body grew frail, her eyes dimmed, and her strength waned. She could no longer work the way she once had, no longer chase away the whispers with the same vigor. And in those quiet moments, she feared the truth would outlive her, that her son would one day stand alone against a world that would not know what to do with him. On her deathbed, she finally spoke words she had carried for decades. With her son by her side, she took his hand and whispered, "You are his. You have always been his. Don't let the world tell you otherwise." And then, with tears streaming down her cheeks, she begged him not to hate the man who had left them behind. He was not free, she whispered. He belonged to the people, not to me. Not even to you. Promise me you won't hate him. The son nodded, but his heart was in turmoil. He wanted to promise. He wanted to let forgiveness wash over him. But how could he forgive a man who had shaped a nation, yet could not even acknowledge his own child? After his mother passed, the son carried her words like stones in his chest. He was free now, free from her warnings, free from her fears. And yet that freedom only deepened his hunger to know more, to find proof, to step into the world that had always been denied to him. He began to travel. Not far at first, but farther than his mother would have dared. He followed the trail of his father's public life, seeking places where the man had spoken, where he had walked, where he had stood before crowds that cheered his name. In those places, the son felt closer to him, as if he were walking in his father's shadow, retracing steps that were written into the bones they shared. He met people who had known the icon, men and women who spoke of him with awe. They described his charisma, his wisdom, his strength. They told stories that made the son swell with pride and burn with sorrow at the same time. They never suspected that the quiet young man before them was more than just another admirer. And yet, for all his searching, the son never found a door that opened into acknowledgement. The icon was shielded by walls of fame, of history, of myth. The son remained on the outside, a ghost pressing his face against the glass of a world that could not see him. But history is not written in silence forever. The cracks were beginning to show. Rumors had a way of slipping into the world, carried on careless tongues, whispered in corners of taverns, spread by those who always seemed to know a little more than they should. And slowly, the truth of the son's existence began to trickle outward. It was dangerous. It threatened to stain the spotless memory of a man who was not supposed to have flaws, not supposed to have secrets. America wanted its heroes pure, its icons untouchable. The idea that one of them might have left behind a hidden child was almost unbearable. And yet the truth was alive, walking in the body of a man who carried the face of history itself. The son could no longer remain in the shadows. He was part of the story, whether the world was ready to hear it or not. The son had spent his life in silence, but silence cannot outlast the pull of truth. By the time he reached his 30s, the resemblance to his father was undeniable. The same broad shoulders, the same steady gaze, the same way of standing, as though the ground itself listened to him. Wherever he went, people turned to look. Strangers would pause in mid-step, struck by the feeling that they had seen this man before, though they could not place him. They were not wrong. They were staring at the hidden reflection of an American icon. He tried to build a life of his own. He worked in rail yards, where iron sparks lit up the night and sweat poured like rain. He took jobs along the river, loading barges, hauling crates, his hands toughened by endless labor. He tried farming for a season, planting corn and beans in rows that stretched beneath the sun. Everywhere he went, he carried himself with the same quiet dignity his mother had taught him. But no matter how hard he tried, no matter what work he did, there was always that unspoken truth following him like a shadow. He was never only himself. He was always also someone else's son out at night. In rented rooms or barns where he laid his head, he often thought about what life might have been if things had been different. If his father had acknowledged him. If his mother had not been forced into secrecy. If he had grown up with the name that should have been his. Would doors have opened? Would opportunities have come? Would the hunger he felt in his heart finally have been satisfied? But history does not often grant what-ifs. It deals in facts, in decisions made long ago that cannot be undone. He learned to listen carefully when people spoke of his father. In taverns, men would lift glasses and tell tales of the icon's bravery, his leadership, his unmatched presence. Old soldiers would recall the thunder of his words on battlefields or at rallies, how entire crowds seemed to rise as one when he spoke. Some spoke of him as though he were not flesh and blood at all, but carved in marble, immortal. And each time, the son felt both pride and sorrow gnaw at him. Pride, because this legend was his blood. Sorrow, because he was forever cut out of the story. There were moments, though, when he dared to dream of stepping forward. He imagined walking into one of those gatherings, standing tall and declaring, "I am his. I am the son you never knew." He pictured the gasps, the stunned faces, the disbelief. He pictured the silence that would fall, the truth that would ripple through the room. But just as quickly as the dream came, fear returned. The world did not want its icons blemished. He knew what would happen. Disbelief, anger, rejection. They would call him a liar, an opportunist, a shameful pretender. His father's followers would crush him beneath their outrage, and so he stayed silent. But the silence grew heavier with each passing year. By now, the icon was no longer just a man in his prime. Age was upon him. His voice, though still strong, carried a weight of years. His hair was streaked with silver, and the son knew time was running out for any chance of being seen, of being acknowledged, of hearing even one word of recognition. The thought haunted him. Would his father die without ever knowing the child he had left behind? In those years, the son traveled further, sometimes drifting into cities where the icon had once stood before cheering crowds. He would walk past halls where speeches had been made, stand on steps where thousands had gathered. He imagined his father standing there, larger than life, his voice echoing, while he, the son, was somewhere else, unseen. He began to feel as though history itself were taunting him, showing him over and over what had been denied. It was in one of these cities, crowded and noisy, that the first confrontation came. A man, older, with sharp eyes, studied the son for a long moment before finally stepping forward. "You've got his look," the man said quietly. Too much to be chance. The son froze, his heart pounding. No one had ever spoken so directly before. He tried to dismiss it, to shrug it off. But the man pressed on. I served with him. I know that face. Who are you? The son walked away without answering, but inside he was trembling. The truth was no longer something he could keep fully hidden. Others could see it, even if they didn't yet dare to say it aloud. Rumors began to spread more boldly. In places where he lingered too long, whispers would grow louder. They say he's connected to the great man. They say he's blood. Some dismissed it as gossip. Others swore it was true. And though the son had never claimed it, the very air around him seemed to shout it for him. This was dangerous ground. America, still young and fragile, needed its heroes clean. The revelation of a secret bloodline could break the illusion, could shatter the myth that held the people together. The son began to feel the weight of that truth pressing down on him, not just for himself, but for the nation that adored a man who had not been whole. And yet the pull was too strong. He could not bury himself in silence forever. He began writing letters, careful, measured words on scraps of paper. Letters addressed to the man whose name he could not bring himself to write in full. Letters that said, I am yours, without ever demanding anything more. But he never sent them. He kept them folded in a small bundle, tucked away in his belongings, words unsent. Confessions never heard. As the icon's health began to falter, the son felt desperation growing. He could not let this end without trying, without reaching across the wall history had built between them. He resolved, at last, to seek him out, to find his way into the presence of the man who had shaped a nation and left him in silence. But the path was not simple. The icon was surrounded by guards, by advisors, by loyal men who had built careers on protecting his reputation. To them, the son would be nothing but a threat, an enemy of the story they had worked so hard to preserve. He knew it would not be easy. He knew it might even destroy him. But for the first time in his life, he was ready to risk everything for the truth. And so, with a heart full of hope and dread, he set out on the journey that would bring him face to face with history itself. The journey to his father was not simple, nor was it swift. The son had little money, and every mile he traveled was earned by the calluses on his hands. He worked odd jobs along the wayloading wagons, mending fences, sweeping floors, anything that would give him enough to keep moving. Each coin he earned brought him closer to the man who had given him life, but not a name. By the time he reached the city, where his father was staying, winter had settled in. The streets were dusted with snow, the air sharp with frost. Crowds still gathered wherever the icon appeared, though he was no longer the fiery figure of his youth. Age had carved lines into his face, and his steps were slower, but the people still adored him. They cheered when he walked past, reaching out just to touch the coat of the man who had come to embody America itself. The son stood in those crowds, pushed against strangers, craning his neck for a glimpse. And when he saw his father, truly saw him, not in photographs or stories, but in flesh and blood, it was as if the world stopped. He was taller than the son expected, more frail than the legends made him, yet his presence was undeniable. The son felt something inside him shift, a mixture of pride and sorrow, so powerful it nearly brought him to his knees. For a moment, he thought of rushing forward, of calling out, of breaking through the crowd with the truth burning in his chest. But fear held him back. The guards would stop him. The people would jeer. The man himself might turn away. And so he remained silent, swallowed by the sea of faces, watching as his father passed by, without ever knowing the eyes of his son were fixed upon him. In the days that followed, the son tried again and again to get closer. He lingered outside the buildings where his father spoke, waited near the hotels where he stayed. Once he even wrote a letter and handed it to a doorman, begging him to deliver it. He never knew if it reached the man inside, or if it was tossed aside as the ramblings of a stranger. Each attempt ended the same way, with distance, with silence, with the knowing truth that he was still invisible. But fate does not always follow the plans of men. One evening, when the snow was falling heavy, the son found himself standing outside a modest house where his father was staying temporarily. The street was quiet, the lamps flickering in the cold wind. Through the window, he could see the glow of firelight, the shadow of the man he had come so far to find. His breath caught in his throat. He was closer than ever before. And then, as if summoned by something beyond his control, the door opened. A figure stepped out into the night, bundled against the cold. It was him, the icon. Alone, if only for a moment, the son's heart thundered. His feet felt rooted to the ground. This was the moment he had dreamed of, the moment he had feared, the moment his entire life had been leading toward. He took a step forward, his voice trembling in his throat, ready to speak the words he had never dared to say, but the words would not come. His father walked past, his breath rising in the frosty air, his footsteps slow, steady. The son stood there, frozen, the truth burning inside him, but silence gripping him tighter than chains. He watched as the man he longed to call father disappeared into the night, unaware that his own flesh and blood had been only a few steps away. That night, the son sat alone in a small rented room, staring at the bundle of unsent letters he carried. He unfolded them one by one, reading the words by candlelight. "I am yours," one said. Another read, "I only want to be seen." Each letter was a cry across time, a plea for recognition that had never been answered. And as the candle burned low, tears fell onto the pages, blurring the ink, smudging the words until they vanished into silence. Not long after, the news spread across the nation. The icon was gone. Death had claimed him, and America mourned as if it had lost its very soul. Newspapers printed his face on their front pages. Crowds filled the streets in grief, and his name was spoken in churches, in schools, in homes. The nation wrapped itself in his memory, sealing him in marble, in legend, in myth. For the son, the news struck like a hammer. The chance was gone forever. He would never hear his father's voice call him by name, never feel the recognition he had craved, never stand beside him as blood acknowledged blood. The silence was now eternal. And yet, in that silence, there was something else, something his mother had whispered long ago. He was not free, she had said. He belonged to the people, not to me, not even to you. The son began to understand those words in a new way. His father had been larger than life, a man claimed by millions. Perhaps there had never been room for him, not as a son, not as family. Perhaps the cost of greatness was solitude, and he had been part of that price. The son lived out his days quietly, never claiming the name that might have changed his life. He worked, he aged, he carried the truth within him. A few knew the whispers, a few saw the resemblance, but the world never recorded him in its books. He remained what history so often forgets, the shadow behind the legend, the bloodline left unspoken. And yet, though his name was lost, his story was not. For every man is more than myth, and every legend leaves behind truths too heavy to stay buried. Somewhere, in the forgotten corners of America's past, there walked a man who was both ordinary and extraordinary, the son of an American icon, unseen, unheard, but bound forever to the story of this nation. His life reminds us of a truth we do not often face, that even the greatest figures of history were flesh and blood, marked by choices, by love, by silence, by the children they acknowledged and the ones they left behind. Heroes are never whole. Legends are never as perfect as we want them to be. And somewhere, in the hidden lines of history, the voices of the forgotten still whisper, waiting to be heard. This was the secret bloodline. This was the untold story of an American icon's lost son.